Life of Jesus, a devotional study by Melva Purkis. Book 7, Chapter 14, The Place of a Skull. Early Christians refused to look at representations of Christ on the cross because they had seen men crucified. Our heart fails and our pen falters as we force ourselves to look at the events of the next 6 hours. It is a sight too terrible to gaze upon for long. Yet to refuse to look at him steadily for a few moments before we wait for the first day of the week is to deny ourselves the consolation of his love. We cannot linger in the shadow of the cross, but we must approach, lift our reluctant eyes steadily to his, and pass on our way with bleeding but strengthened hearts, determined that for us that sacrifice shall not be in vain. They had taken off the blood-soaked robe of purple. His own familiar garments were clinging to his raw flesh as they led him out bowed under his cross. 2 criminals had joined him, groaning under the weight of their grim burdens. It was about 10 in the morning, and the whole city was astir. Roman soldiers in glittering armour forced a way through the milling crowds. They had led him through the city gate towards Golgotha. He staggered under his load. Exhausted by lack of food and sleep, and by the agony of the heavy wood on his butchered flesh, he sank to the ground. The soldiers untied the cords that bound the cross to his back. Simon of Cyrene had probably never heard of Jesus of Nazareth, but he never forgot that laboured walk to Calvary. There is every reason to believe that he continued to bear that cross for the rest of his life, and that his 2 sons also became Christians. There was pity as well as hatred. A great company, mostly women, wailed and lamented. Their cries reached him above the agony of his body. His own suffering was forgotten in his anticipation of theirs. Weep not for me, but weep for yourselves and your children. The awful moment came when the procession halted and the crosses were lowered to the ground. The searing pain of nails in hands and feet, the jolt as the uprights fell into the appointed holes, the torture of overcharged veins taking the weight of the sagging body, the excruciating anguish of every movement, the thirst growing more intolerable every minute. Above him they nailed a board with the triple-tongued inscription, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." The chief priests were not yet content. They must lift the cup of triumph again and again to their cruel lips. They must gloat and rave and taunt. "He saved others," they cried. "Let him save himself. Let Christ the King of Israel descend now from the cross, that we may see and believe." Wave after wave of sin and hatred flowed up to him on the cross. His love fought its last battle and prevailed. Hanging on the cross, he vindicated his promise to his disciples, "Be of good cheer, I have overcome the world." His love poured forth to meet this hate. "Father, forgive them. They know not what they do." The 2 malefactors cursed and railed on him. It was the terrible language of fear and agony. As the hours passed, one thief grew silent and watched him. What he saw brought wonder into his pain-dimmed eyes. His memory slowly awoke, faded in a cloud of anguish, was willed again to life. Jesus of Nazareth. Faith was born. It nourished in this fertile soil of pain and blood. Faith in a sea of hatred and doubt. Slowly he turned to silence his cursing comrade. Dost thou not fear God, seeing thou art in the same condemnation? And we indeed justly, for we receive the due reward of our deeds. But this man hath done nothing amiss. Not smooth words, words gasped out between spells of excruciating pain. Lord, remember me when thou comest into thy kingdom. It was easy to believe on him in Galilee, surrounded by the evidence of his power. But at the mercy of his enemies, tortured and dying, here was faith indeed. He was still the light of the world, the good shepherd, the Lord of life. He was the King who would come in his kingdom. Thou shalt be with me in paradise. Roman soldiers who knew not what he said took up the cry against him. They took his garments and shared them between them by lot. He was dying quickly, mercifully. Many lingered 2 or 3 days. The heavens were darkening. His love had one more ministry to perform. His eyes, glazed with pain and approaching death, sought out and focused 2 familiar faces. Faces that reflected the suffering of his own. Woman, behold thy son. Behold thy mother. 2 hearts sought each other in growing darkness. A heart bleeding from a sword thrust found strength in the kinship of a disciple who loved. A heart breaking with grief found solace in a solemn trust. From that hour that disciple took her into his own home. The unearthly gloom deepened into blackness. The Son of God bowed his head to meet the darkest moments of his life. The hour from which he had shrunk in Gethsemane, pleading for release. For the first time he was alone, bearing in his body the sin of the world. We dare not probe into this mystery of his suffering. Suddenly a great cry burst from him, a cry harsh and unnatural, a cry of utter abandonment. Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. As the 9th hour drew near, his greatest victory was accomplished. He emerged from the horror of desolation to find only the agony remained. A welcome agony, for it had in it once more the assurance of his Father's love. The words of the psalm he had learned as a boy, and had prepared throughout his life to fulfill, came to him in his dying moments. I thirst. There were those who risked the gibes of their comrades to minister to his need with the rough wine of the soldiers. And then God's love was consummated in his Son. It is finished. He met his death with his Father's name on his lips. Father, into thy hand I commend my spirit. His head sank forward on his breast. The earth shuddered at the death of Jesus Christ. The rocks were rent, the buildings of Jerusalem trembled. In the temple that was no longer the house of God, a heavy veil that separated the holy place from the sanctuary was rent from the top to the bottom. Graves were opened, and 3 days later, long dead saints were seen in the city. The centurion in charge of the Roman soldiers gathered under each cross had watched the closing scene. He had doubtless seen many such dreadful sights, but he had never seen a man die like this. And now, as the earth trembled under him, and the shattered rocks hurtled down the hillsides, he turned his eyes to the darkened sky. Truly, this was the Son of God. The Sabbath was drawing near. It would come with sunset. The Jews asked Pilate's consent to break the prisoners' legs so that they could be removed. It was customary to do this with hammers as a final torture to compensate for the merciful release of the spear thrust which followed. But Jesus was already dead. That indignity would bring no response from the silent form. Yet the Roman spear was raised and thrust deep into his side. Water and blood flowed forth. Reproach had broken his heart. Afar off, women watched and wept. A rich man came to Pilate begging the body of Jesus. Joseph of Arimathea had not been summoned to the council. He was known to be a secret disciple. He was a good man and waited for the kingdom of God. Nicodemus joined him. Their fatal nervousness had robbed them of their opportunity of serving the living Christ. But they have earned our love and gratitude for their tender concern for his body. Slowly the cross was lowered. The cruel nails were drawn out. The body was wrapped reverently in a white linen cloth and carried to the garden tomb. There it was more carefully prepared with myrrh and aloes. Gently they laid him to rest. And Mary Magdalene and another Mary, less well known to us but beloved of God, beheld where he was laid.